I wasn't looking for a cemetery when I started cross-referencing county land records with historical railroad expansion maps. I was tracking infrastructure development patterns across the Midwest, the kind of dry archival work that involves scanning hundreds of property deeds and surveying documents from the 1890s, standard historical research, the kind of thing you expect to find minor discrepancies in, clerical errors, mismatched lot numbers, nothing unusual. But then I found the gap. On every map of Cass County, Illinois, from 1887 through 1898, there's a clearly marked burial ground occupying 14 acres on the eastern edge of what was then farmland, about 3 miles outside the town of Beardstown. The maps label it Mound Cemetery, or sometimes Ancient Burial Grounds. County records from 1892 reference it as a protected site. Local newspaper archives from 1895 mention it in passing as a landmark when giving directions to nearby properties. It was there, documented, mapped, referenced in official records. Then, on January 15, 1899, it vanished. Not gradually, not over months or years of development. The land records show a transfer of the entire 14-acre plot on that specific date. The 1900 county survey map shows the same location as vacant farmland with no indication a cemetery ever existed there. No mention of relocation, no documentation of exhumation permits, no records of bodies being transferred to other burial sites, just empty land where 14 acres of graves had been meticulously documented for over a decade. And here's what makes it impossible to dismiss as simple administrative oversight. The Beardstown Chronicle, a local newspaper, ran a front-page story on January 17, 1899, just 2 days after the land transfer. The headline read, "Extensive excavation operations completed in record time." The article describes a mobilization of workers who arrived by special rail transport, worked through the night of January 14th and 15th, and departed before dawn on the 16th. It mentions systematic removal of materials and transportation of archaeological specimens to institutions in the East for further study. The article never uses the word cemetery, it never mentions graves or human remains, but everyone in Beardstown knew what stood on that land. Because for years before 1899, that same newspaper had been reporting discoveries from that exact site. Not folklore, not exaggeration, documented records. The Beardstown Chronicle, May 3, 1893. Remarkable discovery in ancient mounds, skeletal remains of extraordinary proportion unearthed. The article describes skeletons measuring between 9 and 11 feet in length, discovered by farmers plowing near the burial site. It quotes the county coroner as stating the bones were undoubtedly human and of an age predating known settlement of the region. The Quincy Daily Whig, September 12, 1895. Giant bones create sensation in Cass County. This one provides measurements. Femurs 32 inches long, skulls twice the normal circumference, jawbones requiring both hands to hold comfortably. The article notes that similar discoveries have been made throughout the burial ground, suggesting this was no isolated anomaly, but rather a systematic internment of individuals of remarkable stature. The Chicago Tribune, November 8, 1997, scientists baffled by Illinois giant skeletons. By this point, the discoveries had attracted attention from the Field Museum and the University of Chicago. The Tribune reports that preliminary excavations have revealed no fewer than 47 burial sites containing remains of extraordinary size, and quotes a university anthropologist as saying the site may represent evidence of a previously unknown population group indigenous to North America. Then the stories stop. After November 1897, no more newspaper coverage. After January 1899, no more cemetery. The maps get redrawn. The land records show agricultural use where graves had been. And when you search modern archives, when you contact the institutions that supposedly received the remains, the Field Museum, the University of Chicago, the Smithsonian Institution, they all give the same response. No records of receiving skeletal remains from Cass County, Illinois in 1899. No documentation of any transfer. No specimens matching that description in their collections. Missing, lost, misplaced during routine cataloging. 47 burial sites containing the remains of individuals who should not have existed according to standard anthropological models, all vanished in a single coordinated operation, all records erased within 18 months. Ask yourself, why would you erase the dead? But it doesn't stop there. Once you start looking, once you understand the pattern, you find it repeating with disturbing precision across the United States during the exact same time period. The Mound Cemetery in Beardstown wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic erasure. Chillicothe, Ohio. The Ross County Historical Society maintains archives of the Chillicothe Gazette from 1880 through 1902. Between 1887 and 1896, the newspaper published 23 separate articles documenting discoveries of giant human remains from burial mounds throughout the Scioto Valley. The articles describe organized excavations, measurements taken by physicians, and specimens sent to the Smithsonian Institution. Then, in March 1898, county records show a massive land reclamation project along the Scioto River. The burial sites, all of them, were classified as geological survey areas and systematically excavated. The Smithsonian now claims no records exist of receiving skeletal materials from Ross County during that period. Clearwater, Minnesota. The Clearwater Tribune reported in June 1891 the discovery of a burial ground of immense antiquity containing remains of immense stature during railroad bed excavation. Local officials halted construction for 3 weeks while anthropological experts from East Coast institutions examined the site. Then construction resumed. The burial ground was removed. Modern searches of university collections that supposedly received materials from that excavation turn up nothing. No specimens, no photographs, no documentation. Sayre, Pennsylvania. This one haunts me because of how thoroughly it was documented, how impossible it should have been to erase. In 1882, a team from the American Investigating Museum in Philadelphia excavated a mound near Sayre that contained skeletons described in contemporary accounts as 7 feet tall, with skulls featuring horn-like protrusions. The discovery made national news. Sketches were published. Scientists from multiple institutions examined the remains. The bones were transported to the American Investigating Museum for permanent display. The American Investigating Museum closed in 1893. Its collections were supposedly transferred to the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. The Academy has no record of receiving skeletal remains matching that description. The building that housed the American Investigating Museum was demolished in 1897. The excavation site near Sayre was covered by a rail depot in 1909. Every physical trace erased within 18 years of discovery. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Giant burial sites discovered and documented in the 1880s and early 1900s, national attention, scientific examination, promises of preservation and study. Then systematic removal between 1895 and 1902. Then institutional amnesia. Every museum, every university, every archive with the same response. We have no record of that. The timing is what reveals this wasn't random, wasn't coincidence, wasn't independent decisions by separate institutions. These removals happened simultaneously across the country during a 7-year window. and they coincide exactly with something else that was being erased from public record during the same period: Tartaria. If you examine encyclopedias and atlases published before 1890, you'll find Tartaria mapped as a vast territory spanning northern Asia, labeled with the same casual certainty as France or Prussia. The 1892 Encyclopedia Britannica devotes multiple pages to Tartary, describing cities, trade routes, and governmental structures. Historical maps from the 1880s show it as the largest landmass designation in Asia. Then something changed. The 1902 Encyclopedia Britannica removes almost all references. The entry for Tartary shrinks to a single paragraph, explaining it as an obsolete geographical term. Maps published after 1900 divide the same territory into Russian administrative regions with no mention of what had been there before. Not conquered, not absorbed, erased, as if it had never existed. And here's what connects it to the vanished cemeteries. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, the same period these giant burial sites were being documented in America, explorers and archaeologists working in Central Asia were reporting identical discoveries. The British Royal Geographical Society archives contain expedition reports from 1887 through 1896 describing burial mounds in regions then labeled as Tartary, containing skeletal remains of extraordinary dimension. Russian imperial records reference persons of unusual stature serving in administrative and military roles in territories along the Siberian frontier. French archaeological journals from the 1890s document excavations in Mongolia, revealing organized burial practices suggesting a population distinct in physical characteristics from known indigenous groups. Then the reports stop. After 1898, virtually no documentation of giant skeletal discoveries from Central Asia. After 1900, Tartaria disappears from maps. After 1902, American institutions claimed they never received the giant skeletons they'd been publicly documented as accepting. The pattern isn't limited to one region or one country. It's coordinated across continents, across institutions, across governmental and academic structures. What if the burial sites in Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, what if they weren't anomalies? What if they were evidence of something much larger? What if the individuals buried there were connected to the civilization being erased from cartographic and historical record at the exact same moment? It would explain why the removal operations happened so quickly, so systematically, with such coordinated silence afterward. It would explain why institutions that proudly announced their acquisition of specimens in the 1890s now claim those specimens never existed. It would explain why the timing clusters so precisely around 1999, the same year the last major references to Tartaria vanish from official publications. And it would explain something else, something I found in the private diary of a train rail surveyor named Thomas Hendricks, now held in the Illinois State Historical Library. Hendricks was contracted to survey the land where Mound Cemetery had stood, 6 months after its removal. His diary entry from July 1999 describes the site as unnaturally level, as though great effort had been expended to eliminate all trace of previous use. He notes depressions in the earth, suggesting recent excavation of considerable depth, and makes an observation that should chill anyone paying attention. The quantity of earth removed must have been enormous, far exceeding what would be necessary for typical grave location. Whatever was taken from this place, they wanted no evidence of it remaining. They didn't just move the bodies, they removed the earth itself, tons of it, as if the graves alone weren't enough, as if something about the soil, the depth of the burial shafts, the physical evidence of how deep these individuals were interred, all of it had to vanish.
Why would you excavate several feet below grave depth? Why would you transport not just skeletal remains, but the surrounding earth, unless the graves themselves revealed something about the individuals buried there? Their size, their proportions, the dimensions of coffins required to contain them. I kept digging through county records, cross-referencing property transfers with contemporary newspaper accounts, looking for any physical evidence that survived the erasure. And I found something they missed. In 2007, during construction of a commercial development on the outskirts of Beardstown, work crews uncovered a section of wrought iron fencing 3 feet below current ground level. The fencing matched the decorative style typical of 1880s cemetery boundaries, but the unusual thing, the thing that stopped construction for 2 days while the County Historical Society examined it, was the scale. The fence posts stood 9 feet tall, not decorative height, functional height. Cemetery fencing serves a purpose. It marks boundaries and prevents casual trespassing. But 9-foot fencing is excessive for that purpose, unless you're trying to ensure privacy from observers who themselves might stand considerably taller than average. The posts were anchored in concrete foundations, dated through chemical analysis to approximately 1890. They were discovered 400 yards from where historical maps place the eastern boundary of Mound Cemetery. The County Historical Society cataloged the fencing, took photographs, and filed a report noting its unusual dimensions. Then the commercial development proceeded. The fencing was removed and, according to the Historical Society's records, transferred to storage pending future display. When I contacted them to examine the pieces, I was told the items were currently in off-site storage with no available access schedule. 3 follow-up requests over 6 months received the same response. Physical evidence, documented and cataloged, rendered inaccessible. But here's what they couldn't hide. The photographs exist in the public filing, and in those photographs you can see something they didn't notice when they cataloged it. The fence posts show wear marks, deep grooves in the iron, the kind created by rope or chain friction. Not at ground level, not at the height where a normal human would attach restraints. The wear marks are 7 to 8 feet up the posts. As if whoever maintained that cemetery, whoever worked there, whoever secured loads or tethered animals, or performed the routine physical labor of burial ground upkeep, did so from a height far above normal human reach. Ask yourself, who builds 9-foot cemetery fencing with wear marks 8 feet off the ground? And then there are the coffins. This is where the evidence becomes impossible to dismiss as simple misunderstanding or exaggeration. In 1924, 25 years after Mound Cemetery vanished, a farmer named Albert Kraus was excavating a drainage ditch on property adjacent to where the cemetery had stood. His plow struck something solid 4 feet below the surface. He uncovered a section of what he described in a letter to the County Historical Society as a wooden burial container of immense size. Kraus measured it. The letter includes specific dimensions, 12 feet in length, 4 feet in width, constructed from oak planks 3 inches thick. He noted that no normal human being could require such dimensions and speculated it might have been a mass burial container. But mass burials don't use individual coffins, and this wasn't the only one. Over the following decade, as more land near the former cemetery was developed, at least 4 similar discoveries were reported to county authorities. Each time, the explanation offered was anomalous storage container or misidentified agricultural equipment. But coffins have a distinctive shape. They taper. They're designed for a specific purpose, and every farmer who found one recognized exactly what it was, even if the size made no sense. The coffins tell us something the institutional silence can't erase. They tell us the scale of the individuals buried at Mound wasn't exaggeration, wasn't misidentification of animal bones or geological formations. 12-foot coffins don't get manufactured by accident. They don't appear in burial grounds by mistake.
Someone built them. Someone transported them.
Someone interred bodies that required them. And that brings us back to the central question that no official explanation addresses. Why? Why mobilize workers in the middle of the night? Why remove not just bodies, but earth, fencing, every trace of the cemetery's existence? Why coordinate similar operations across multiple states during the same narrow time window? Why do institutions that publicly documented receiving these remains now claim they never existed? The standard explanation, when any explanation is offered at all, is land development, railway expansion, agricultural reclamation, progress. The narrative is that late 19th century America was modernizing rapidly, and old burial grounds were simply relocated to make room for infrastructure. Routine administrative procedure. But routine relocation creates paper trails, exhumation permits, transfer documentation, cemetery plot assignments at the new location, death certificates cross-referenced with new burial records. The bureaucracy of moving the dead is extensive precisely because society treats burial with legal and cultural gravity. None of that paperwork exists for Mound Cemetery, or for the Scioto Valley sites, or for the Clearwater Burial Ground, or for dozens of similar locations across America where giant skeletal remains were documented, publicized, examined by credentialed scientists, and then vanished without bureaucratic trace. What disturbs me most isn't the removal itself, it's the coordinated silence that followed. Academic institutions don't debate whether the giant skeletons existed. They pretend the question was never asked. Museums don't explain what happened to specimens they publicly acknowledged receiving. They act as though the documentation doesn't exist. Historical societies don't investigate discrepancies in land records. They file them as administrative anomalies and move on. It's not active suppression, it's passive erasure, questions that simply aren't asked, evidence that isn't examined, patterns that aren't acknowledged because acknowledging them leads to conclusions that don't fit the established narrative of human history. And when you point it out, when you lay the evidence side by side, the newspaper articles, the land records, the institutional correspondence, the physical artifacts, the response is always the same: interesting, but not significant. As if 47 burial sites vanishing overnight is routine, as if coordinated removal operations across multiple states is coincidence, as if institutional amnesia affecting dozens of museums simultaneously is administrative oversight. But the physical evidence remembers even when the institutions forget. The 9-foot fence posts, the 12-foot coffins, the surveyor's diary noting excavation depths far exceeding what would be necessary, the newspaper articles describing skeletons between 9 and 11 feet in length with measurements taken by physicians and coroners. These weren't myths. These weren't folklore passed down through generations of embellishment. These were documented observations by credentialed professionals, published in mainstream newspapers and examined by university scientists. The evidence was physical, measured, photographed, and cataloged according to the scientific standards of the era. Then it vanished, systematically, simultaneously, silently. And here's what keeps me searching through archives, cross-referencing maps, requesting access to historical society storage. If they went to this much effort to erase one cemetery, how many others vanished the same way? How many burial sites were removed before anyone thought to document them? How many discoveries were made by farmers or construction workers who were told to rebury what they found and never speak of it? The Beardstown site was documented because local newspapers covered the initial discoveries for years. But what about rural burial grounds with no nearby towns, no journalists, no one to create the paper trail that makes erasure detectable?
What about the sites removed before 1890, before the pattern becomes visible, when each operation could be dismissed as an isolated incident?
I don't have definitive answers, only questions that accumulate, that build upon each other, that create a weight the official narrative can't support. Why does a 14-acre cemetery vanish from land records on a specific date? Why do the bodies supposedly transferred to institutions leave no receiving documentation? Why do similar erasures cluster in a 7-year window? Why does this timing coincide exactly with Tartaria's removal from maps and encyclopedias? Why would you erase the dead unless what they represented, what they proved about recent history, contradicted something you needed people to believe? The maps before 1900 tell one story, the maps after tell another, and in between, in that narrow window, something was systematically removed from physical reality and historical record. Not just bodies, not just burial sites, evidence. Evidence of human beings who existed at a scale we're told is impossible, buried with ceremonial care in organized cemeteries, discovered and documented by credible witnesses, then erased with coordinated precision. The 9-foot posts remain in off-site storage. The 12-foot coffins were documented, then dismissed as misidentified agricultural equipment. The institutional collections that supposedly received 47 skeletons claim they never existed. And Mound Cemetery, mapped and referenced for over a decade, vanished on January 15, 1899, removed in a single night by workers who arrived by special rail transport and departed before dawn. The official position is that nothing significant happened, that this is all coincidence, misunderstanding, clerical error compounded across decades and institutions, that the pattern is illusion, that asking why is somehow inappropriate. But the land remembers, even if the records don't. The earth removed far exceeding what would be necessary, the fence posts built 9 feet tall, the coffins requiring 12 feet of length, the newspaper articles describing systematic discoveries of individuals whose existence challenges every assumption about who we are and what came before us. Who were the giants buried at Mound Cemetery? Why were they interred with such care, such permanence, in organized burial grounds, suggesting community and continuity? Why did their disappearance require such extraordinary effort, such coordinated silence, such systematic erasure of every trace? And what else vanished with them on that January night in 1899 that we're still pretending was never there at all?